Welcome, dear listener, to another gentle mystery in the charming village of St. Mary Mead, where quiet hedgerows, tidy cottages, and polite afternoon teas hide the most curious puzzles. Today we follow Miss Jane Marple, our quietly brilliant silver-haired sleuth, as she unthreads a most unusual dilemma involving embroidery, secrets, and a mystery stitched into the very heart of village life. Settle in with a warm cup of tea. Chapter 1. The calm before the stitch. The morning light drifted softly over the village of St. Mary Mead, warming its thatched rooftops and neat hedgerows in a way that made even the most hurried soul feel inclined toward gentleness. It was the sort of spring morning that persuaded birds to sing louder and humans to soften their tones. A thin mist lifted lazily from the meadows, revealing the cobbled lanes that wound between cottages as though drawn by the careful hand of a meticulous draftsman. And in one such cottage, prim, tidy, and as orderly as its owner, Miss Jane Marple sat by her parlor window, knitting needles clicking like the muted rhythm of a clock marking time for a story not yet begun. She had already finished her morning tea, set aside the Times after a brief review of notable events, and now found herself watching the village in its habitual waking dance. Mrs. Weatherby, the postmistress, bicycled past with great determination. Mr. Collins swept his front step with an enthusiasm that suggested a visitor was expected, and a pair of children likely on some secret errand far more important in their eyes than any matter ever brought before Parliament, scampered by with the furtive air of conspirators. Miss Marple observed all with mild amusement. At her age, one learned that the world rarely surprised, but people still did endlessly, with their quirks and anxieties and private dramas tucked neatly behind polite smiles. Today was a day of modest importance within the village, the annual St. Mary Mead Needlework Circle exhibition. The event had become something of a local tradition, a pleasant display of talent, patience, and delicate artistry. Lace, quilts, embroidered samplers, applique landscapes, all arranged tableside in the church hall as proudly as soldiers on parade. Some pieces were triumphs of detail, others bore the earnest irregularities of beginners. But each told a story of hands that worked steadily through long evenings by the fire. Miss Marple herself, though skilled with knitting needles, often deferred to those more accomplished in embroidery. Stitching, she would say with a modest smile, requires a patience I reserve strictly for human nature. Yet she attended the exhibition each year, appreciating the craftsmanship and finding no small delight in the gossip that inevitably accompanied such gatherings. The talk this year revolved around Mrs. Harriet Winchwood, a newcomer whose sudden arrival in the village last autumn had stirred a flurry of curiosity. Harriet was in her early 40s, elegant in an understated way, quiet, intelligent, and with an air of someone accustomed to cities rather than sleepy lanes. Her needlework, however, was indisputably rural in spirit, filled with flowers, soft colors, and an intricacy that enthralled even the most competitive members of the needlework circle. Her featured piece for the exhibition was a sampler titled The Lady's Garden, which villagers described with various shades of awe. Some said it looked like a tapestry in miniature. Others whispered that she must have been professionally trained. Mrs. Lydia Harrow, long-standing champion of the circle, had sniffed that one ought not show off in village exhibitions, but her bitterness failed to hide her insecurity. Miss Marple, never one to rush to judgment, had found Harriet's work quite charming and saw no reason why Lydia should not be gracefully displaced after so many years of unchallenged glory. But envy was a weed with stubborn roots. Miss Marple tucked her knitting carefully into its basket, rose from her seat, and prepared to leave for the hall, when a hurried knock rattled her front door. The quick, anxious rhythm suggested someone flustered, perhaps even distressed. Miss Marple, who recognized human emotion as easily as a botanist identifies species of leaves, moved promptly to open it. Standing on her step was Emily Price, the vicar's young wife. Her cheeks were flushed and her normally tidy hat sat at a troubled angle, as though put on with less care than usual. Her hands clutched the handle of her handbag so tightly that her knuckles paled beneath the strain. "Miss Marple," she gasped before the older woman could even greet her. "Oh, Miss Marple, something dreadful has happened." "Do come in, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, ushering her into the parlor with the soft authority of one who had soothed many a frazzled villager over the years. "Let us take matters calmly. Sit down. A bit of excitement this early in the morning rarely bodes well." Emily obeyed, breath-catching as she tried to compose herself. "It's the exhibition," she managed. "Harriet Winchwood's sampler, the beautiful one, the Ladies' Garden. It's gone." Miss Marple blinked, her expression neither shocked nor dismissive. "Gone? Missing. Stolen, perhaps, and something else was left in its place." Emily swallowed, visibly shaken. "A very strange piece, quite horrid compared to hers. It's all thorns and broken threads and the phrase stitched across it." She took another breath. "It says the truth is buried." Miss Marple's brow lifted ever so slightly, not in alarm but in interest. A message replacing a beautiful sampler? That was quite unusual indeed. "I see," she murmured. "And Harriet?" "That's the other thing," Emily said, voice dropping. "No one has seen her since yesterday evening. She was meant to arrive early to help with the displays, but she never came." Miss Marple reached for her shawl with composed efficiency. "Well, my dear, needlework often reveals more than it intends. Threads can hide secrets just as words can conceal meanings. Why don't we take a look at this curious piece you found? A good stitcher can always identify the hand behind the work." Emily, clearly relieved by Miss Marple's steady presence, nodded quickly. "Yes. Yes, please. Everyone's terribly confused, and Mrs. Harrow is already saying things I wish she wouldn't." "I should expect as much," Miss Marple replied, fastening her brooch. "Envy often speaks louder than reason." Together they walked through the village, following the winding lane toward the church hall. Along the way, Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the smallest details. Mr. Collins still sweeping with suspicious vigor. Mrs. Weatherby glancing their way with furtive curiosity. And young Tommy Brooke whistling much too loudly for someone who pretended not to be eavesdropping. The village hummed with the pleasant facade of peace, but beneath it lay the unmistakable stir of something unsettled. Upon arriving at the church hall, Miss Marple was greeted by a low murmur of voices, anxious, puzzled, and in some cases delighted at the novelty of scandal. Several women clustered near the central table where the displays stood. Mrs. Harrow, of course, occupied prime position, arms folded across her chest as though defending her long-held title. Beside her stood Mrs. Archer and Miss Penelope Drabs, both wide-eyed and whispering behind gloved fingers. When Emily led Miss Marple through the gathering, the older woman moved with graceful purpose. She took in each display with a glance: delicate lace, cheerful cross-stitch patterns, a rather over-ambitious quilt, but her gaze settled swiftly on the sampler in question. It was startling. Dark threads shaped gnarled thorn branches twisting across the cloth. Sections of the design were intentionally frayed, as if cut and re-sewn. And in the center, formed from perfectly even stitches, was the ominous phrase, "The truth is buried." Miss Marple leaned closer, inspecting the tension of the threads, the choice of colors, the evenness of the stitching. Nothing about the work was amateurish. If anything, its craftsmanship matched Harriet's level of skill, yet the style was harsh, bordering on symbolic. Behind her, Lydia Harrow spoke in a clipped tone. "Quite a dramatic stunt." though I suppose one must do something extraordinary if one wishes to remain the subject of village attention." Miss Marple turned calmly. "Mrs. Harrow, you do realize that Harriet herself has not come forward this morning?" "Oh, I'm sure she's simply trying to build suspense," Lydia replied, though her voice lacked conviction. "Some people are quite theatrical." Miss Marple said nothing. Lydia grew uneasy under her mild gaze. Then Miss Marple straightened and addressed Emily. "I assume the police have not yet been called." Emily shook her head. "We weren't certain it was serious enough." "Well," Miss Marple said with a thoughtful hum, "perhaps not yet. But embroidery is a language of its own. One learns much from the hand that creates it." She reached out and gently touched the corner of the dark sampler. This was stitched by someone accustomed to expressing themselves quietly but with profound intent. Someone who knows how to hide meanings within patterns. "Do you think Harriet made it herself?" Emily whispered nervously. "No," Miss Marple said, almost without hesitation. "Harriet's work is graceful, calm. Even her more intricate designs possess a softness. This piece was made with tension. Deliberate tension." Mrs. Archer leaned forward. "Do you mean to say, Miss Marple, that someone is trying to frighten her?" "I mean to say," Miss Marple replied, "that someone wishes to convey a message, and that they have chosen, not unwisely, needlework as their medium." A hush fell. Miss Marple continued, "Where was Harriet's sampler displayed yesterday?" Emily led her to the far end of the table. The space was empty save for a few stray threads, soft green and pale blue, colors Harriet favored. Miss Marple lifted one between her fingers. It was cleanly cut. She murmured. "Removed with precision." "You mean the thief brought scissors?" Mrs. Harrow asked, as though this elevated the crime. "Anyone who embroiders would have a pair," Miss Marple replied, "though not everyone would make so clean a cut." Emily looked pale again. "Miss Marple, what should we do?" Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. "First, we must ascertain where Harriet Winchwood has gone. Second, we must discover who stitched this message and why. Something in Harriet's work clearly unsettled someone. Perhaps something she intended to reveal." "Reveal?" Mrs. Archer echoed. "But what could needlework reveal?" Miss Marple gave her a gentle smile. "My dear Mrs. Archer, people reveal the most extraordinary things through their hobbies. A person may speak plainly even when they never utter a word." She cast another long look at the replacement sampler, her gaze thoughtful and precise, as though the thorns themselves were whispering secrets. "And in this case," she said softly, "someone has gone to great lengths to bury the truth, which makes it all the more important that we uncover it." Thus the calm morning in St. Mary Mead ended not with the predictable patterns of everyday life, but with the first pull of a thread Miss Marple knew from long experience would lead somewhere quite unexpected indeed. Chapter 2. A Village in Threads. The disappearance of Harriet Winchwood and the unsettling replacement sampler cast a quiet but unmistakable pall over St. Mary Mead, as though a cloud had drifted across the sun and lingered. Miss Marple, as she often did when matters took a curious turn, began her inquiries not with great fanfare but with the gentle, almost invisible precision of a needle slipping through cloth. She understood well that the village, for all its charm and tranquility, was a tapestry of personalities woven together by proximity, shared histories, and the intricate tensions that simmered beneath polite smiles. And so she moved carefully through its lanes and cottages, allowing each encounter to reveal its own threads of truth or falsehood. Her first visit was to Mrs. Lydia Harrow, whose home, Rose Cottage, stood primly behind an overabundance of rose bushes that bloomed with the ferocity of a woman determined to maintain appearances. Lydia received her at the doorway, stiff-backed and visibly on edge, though she tried to disguise it beneath a veneer of indifference. "If you've come to inquire again about that sampler business," she said, ushering Miss Marple into a parlor decorated in shades of mauve, "I'm afraid I've nothing more to add. Harriet's work went missing. A dreadful piece appeared in its place. That is all I know." Miss Marple smiled mildly and settled onto the firmest chair available. "Of course, my dear, but I thought perhaps you might share your thoughts. You have been part of the needlework circle for many years, after all." At this, Lydia's mouth thinned. "I have, and never before has such a spectacle occurred. Truly, it is quite improper." She poured tea as though the pot had personally offended her. "I shall say only this. Harriet's arrival disrupted the natural order. I don't mean to be unkind. She was pleasant enough. But one cannot deny she had a flair for drama. All those elaborate designs, those secretive little smiles. It's as though she wished to provoke curiosity." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Do you believe she orchestrated the disappearance herself? I wouldn't put it past her. Some people are desperate for attention." Lydia hesitated, her eyes darting toward the window. "And some," she added with a softer tone, "have things they wish to hide." Harriet was always probing into village history, family lines, old stories better left alone. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her mind tucked away the remark like a scrap of fabric saved for later use. After leaving Rosebank Cottage, Miss Marple made her way toward the vicarage, where she found Reverend Thomas Blythe polishing the small brass cross that adorned his desk. He greeted her warmly, but his welcome faltered when she mentioned Harriet. "A troubling business indeed," he murmured, adjusting his spectacles. "Emily told me the replacement sampler contained a phrase. Something about truth?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "The truth is buried. Rather enigmatic, don't you think?" The Reverend cleared his throat. "I suppose so. Though one must not read too much into dramatic gestures, Mrs. Winchwood was interested in matters of the past." He shifted uneasily. "Old records, genealogies, church archives. I allowed her to review them, of course. Purely historical curiosity. She said she was tracing her husband's lineage." Miss Marple observed him closely. "Did she find anything of significance?" Reverend Blythe shook his head too quickly. "Nothing I recall. Simply the usual births and deaths." His evasiveness was almost palpable, a faint tremor beneath the smooth surface of his clerical composure. Miss Marple thanked him politely and took her leave, reflecting on the Reverend's discomfort. He was not, she suspected, a man easily ruffled, unless something of personal importance was at stake. Her next stop was the cottage of Mr. Bernard Lacey, the village historian and a widower known for his meticulous habits. Bernard answered the door with a stack of papers in hand, which he fumbled the moment he saw Miss Marple. "Ah, Miss Marple, I wasn't expecting visitors." She offered a gentle smile. "I apologized for the intrusion. I wish to inquire about Harriet Winchwood. I understand she sought your expertise." Bernard's anxious expression deepened. Yes, she did. Harriet had an interest in the older families of St. Mary Mead, quite an intense interest. He gestured her inside, where books and papers formed haphazard towers. She asked about certain scandals of the past, matters we don't often discuss. Old affairs, questionable parentage, disputes over property. You know how villages are. Miss Marple nodded. And did you provide her with the information she sought? Some, Bernard admitted, but she seemed to know more than she should, as though she had already uncovered something and wished only to confirm it. His voice dropped. I advised her to tread lightly. Some truths, Miss Marple, do more harm than good when exhumed. As Miss Marple walked back toward the village square, her thoughts circled around these conversations. Lydia's resentment, Reverend Blythe's nervousness, Bernard's caution, all pointed toward one conclusion. Harriet Winchwood had stumbled upon something sensitive, something someone wished to keep hidden. And yet none of them seemed capable of producing the ominous sampler left in Harriet's place. The stitches she had examined bore the hallmark of practiced hands, hands familiar with subtlety, detail, and emotional restraint. Before returning home, Miss Marple decided to visit the last person connected to Harriet, her stepdaughter, Alice Winchwood. Alice had arrived from London only a month ago, bringing with her an air of cool detachment that puzzled the villagers. Some found her aloof, others admired her poise. Miss Marple found her curious, neither warm nor cold, but guarded, as though protecting a private grief or resentment. Alice answered the door promptly, dressed in a fashionable blouse and skirt quite at odds with village sensibilities. "Miss Marple," she said with faint surprise. "Is this about my stepmother?" "Yes, my dear, you must be quite concerned." Alice stepped aside to let her in, but offered no further warmth. The sitting room bore traces of hurried activity, a half-packed suitcase, open books, and a basket of uneven mending. Miss Marple's eyes rested briefly on a scrap of cloth bearing a motif of thorns. Alice followed her gaze and stiffened. "Just practice," she said quickly. "I've been trying to improve my stitching." "Very industrious," Miss Marple replied lightly, though she noted the tightness in Alice's voice. "When did you last see Harriet?" Alice hesitated. "Yesterday afternoon. She said she was going to the church hall to make adjustments to her display." She seemed thoughtful, not upset but occupied. "Did she mention any discoveries? Anything that troubled her?" "No," Alice said too quickly, then corrected herself. "Not exactly. She hinted that she had learned something important, something about family." Miss Marple waited. Alice pressed her lips together. But she wouldn't say more. A pause stretched, filled with unspoken tension. "Do you think she's run off?" Alice asked suddenly. "She can be impulsive." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "I believe Harriet intended to reveal something today, and someone wished to stop her." As she stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, Miss Marple felt the first true tug of the thread she had been following. 4 suspects stood before her, each with motives, secrets, and fears. But only one had the skill to stitch a coded message. And only one, she suspected, understood precisely what Harriet Winchwood had uncovered. Chapter 3. The First Clues. The next morning arrived with a sharp metallic chill in the air, the kind that seeped through windows and into thoughts, making everything feel a little heavier. Aisha barely slept, her mind replaying the moment she found that notebook, the strange coded writing, the eerie mention of the girl in the fog. She sat up, rubbing her eyes, and forced herself to breathe slowly. Today, she told herself, she would get answers, no matter how tangled the mystery became. After getting dressed, she headed toward college, but her bag felt heavier than usual, as if the notebook inside carried more than paper, as if it carried a presence. Walking through the campus gate, Aisha immediately sensed something off. Students gathered in small, whispering clusters, heads bent, expressions tense. She slowed her pace, glancing around until she spotted her friend Hania waving her over with urgency. Before Aisha could speak, Hania grabbed her wrist and pulled her behind a large pillar near the library. "Aisha, you heard?" Hania whispered, eyes wide and frightened. "Another girl went missing last night." Aisha's heart dropped. "Missing? Who?" Hania shook her head. "A first-year student. No one saw anything. They only found her bag near the old staircase behind the science block." Aisha swallowed hard. That staircase was the same place she had felt that strange presence 2 days ago. Her pulse quickened. "Does anyone know what happened?" Hania hesitated. Some students said they heard footsteps, heavy ones, but no one was there. Aisha's breath caught, and for a moment the campus around her blurred. The mystery was no longer confined to a notebook. It was here, woven into the walls, the corridors, the silence. After attending 2 classes in a haze, Aisha couldn't ignore the pull anymore. Something inside her, fear, curiosity, or something deeper, urged her to go back to the staircase. She waited until the crowd thinned and then slipped toward the back of the science block. The cold wind brushed her face and shadows pooled along the old structure. As she stepped onto the first cracked stair, the world around her seemed to hush. She descended slowly, each step creaking, her hand brushing the rough wall for balance. When she reached the bottom, she noticed something new carved into the cement. Marks, deep and jagged, forming a symbol she had never seen before. Her chest tightened. She reached out to touch it, but a sudden gust of freezing air swept across her fingers like a warning. She snatched her hand back and stumbled away. That symbol was not there before. Someone or something had carved it recently. Leaving the staircase, Aisha headed straight home, unable to shake the prickling sensation running down her spine. As soon as she entered her room, she pulled the mysterious notebook from her bag and opened it to the page with the strange writing. The symbols seemed to pulse as if alive. She traced a line lightly with her finger, and to her horror, the ink dragged under her touch, smearing like fresh paint. Heart pounding, she stepped back. That ink was not normal. She flipped to the next page and froze. A new line had appeared, one she was certain wasn't there before. "She is close now." Aisha's throat tightened. Someone was writing in this notebook. Someone who knew she had found it. Someone who was watching. The room suddenly felt too silent, too still. She slowly approached her window, peered outside, and scanned the street. Everything looked normal. Kids playing, a vendor calling out, a stray cat crossing the road. But the unease in her chest didn't fade. She shut the curtains, locked her door, and sat on the edge of her bed, gripping the notebook tightly. She needed help, someone who wouldn't think she was imagining things. She picked up her phone, hesitated, then texted Hania, "I need to show you something. Come tomorrow." That night, sleep refused to come. Every small sound made her flinch. The settling of pipes, the rustle of wind, the distant honk of a car. Around midnight, a soft tapping sound came from her window. Her body froze. Tap, tap, tap. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. She didn't dare move. After a long moment, the tapping stopped, replaced by a dragging sound along the glass like nails trailing lightly. Aisha closed her eyes tightly, gripping her blanket. Only when the noise faded did she finally open them again. She stayed awake until dawn, her heart still shaking. In the morning, exhausted but determined, she returned to college with the notebook sealed in her bag. She met Hania near the canteen, her friend's expression already anxious. "You look pale. What happened?" Aisha handed her the notebook silently. Hania opened it carefully, flipping to the strange message. "Aisha, this is not normal." Before Aisha could respond, a sharp scream echoed from the far side of campus. Students rushed toward the noise, panic spreading through the yard. Aisha and Hania exchanged a terrified look and followed the crowd. Near the old staircase, a security guard stood trembling, his face drained of color. Something lay at his feet, a scarf, torn and dirt-stained. Hania whispered, "That belongs to the missing girl." Aisha's breath hitched. Her eyes drifted to the staircase again, and for a brief moment she thought she saw a figure standing in the shadows. A girl. Pale, blurred around the edges like she didn't fully belong to this world. Aisha blinked and the figure vanished. Her hands trembled. The notebook in her bag felt heavier than ever. The fog around the mystery thickened. And Aisha knew this was only the beginning. Chapter 4. False Patterns. The weight of the previous day settled heavily on Aisha's shoulders as she sat in her room that evening, staring at the notebook lying on her desk like an accusation. She had placed it there deliberately, almost challengingly, as if daring it to reveal more secrets. But the pages remained still, silent, waiting. The memory of the pale, blurred figure near the old staircase replayed in her mind, refusing to fade. She wasn't sure anymore if what she had seen was real or simply the result of fear and exhaustion. But a voice deep inside whispered that it had been real, too real. She rubbed her temples, trying to steady her thoughts, but the room felt too small, the air too heavy. A slow chill crept across her skin as though something unseen lingered in the corners, watching her every move. She knew she couldn't keep the mystery to herself any longer. Not when girls were disappearing. Not when strange symbols were appearing on campus. Not when the notebook seemed alive. She needed answers, or at the very least someone who could help her uncover the truth. Hania was worried but willing to listen, and tomorrow they had planned to meet during lunch break. The thought brought little comfort. But it was something. Aisha glanced at the clock, seeing that it was barely 10 p.m., though it felt much later. She sighed deeply, reached for her blanket, and decided to attempt sleep again, though she doubted she would find rest. As she lay down, the darkness in the room felt unusually thick, pressing in from all sides. She squeezed her eyes shut, but the tapping she'd heard the previous night haunted her. Hours seemed to pass before she finally drifted into a restless sleep, only to be snapped awake by a faint whisper, soft, close, and unmistakably inside her room. Her heart leaped to her throat as she bolted upright, breathing hard. She scanned the room quickly. Nothing. No movement, no shadows shifting, no presence she could identify. But she knew she hadn't imagined the whisper. It felt too close, too real, like someone had stood right beside her bed. Unable to calm down, she got up and paced the room, each step shaky. She considered waking her parents, but what would she even say? That she heard a whisper from something that wasn't there. She pressed her palm over her mouth, trying to stifle a gasp as a sudden thought crossed her mind. What if the whisper came from the notebook? Slowly, dread coiling in her stomach, she turned toward the desk. The notebook remained closed, unmoving. Yet something about its presence felt different, as if it carried a pulse of its own. She approached it cautiously and reached out with trembling fingers. Just as she touched it, a sudden icy breeze swept through the room, chilling her to the bone. She spun around toward the window, but it was closed tightly. No wind could have entered. Her nerves shattered. Aisha grabbed the notebook, shoved it into her bag, and sat back on her bed, hugging her knees to her chest until the sky outside began to lighten. When morning finally arrived, she dressed hurriedly, needing to escape the suffocating atmosphere of her room. She left early, walking to college faster than usual, glancing over her shoulder more times than she cared to count. Every sound behind her made her flinch. Footsteps on the pavement, the rustle of leaves, the distant bark of a dog. She felt watched, even though the street was empty. At college, she met Hania near the entrance. "Aisha, you look terrible," Hania said immediately, gripping her arm. Aisha forced a weak smile. "I didn't sleep." They walked together toward a quiet corner of the campus garden. As soon as they sat down, Aisha pulled the notebook from her bag and handed it to Hania. "Last night was strange," she admitted softly. "I heard whispers. I felt something in my room." Hania opened the notebook carefully, her eyes scanning the pages. "Did anything new appear?" she asked. Aisha shook her head. "Not that I saw." Hania exhaled slowly. Aisha, what if this notebook belonged to one of the missing girls? The idea hit Aisha like a blow. She had never considered it. She swallowed hard. But why would it end up with me? Hania closed the notebook. Maybe you were meant to find it. Before Aisha could respond, they were interrupted by the shrill ring of the college emergency alarm. Students around them froze in confusion. The two friends exchanged a tense look and hurried toward the main building where a crowd was already forming. A security officer stood on the steps, his voice trembling as he made an announcement. "Another student is missing," he said, his words cutting through the air like a blade. "We are increasing patrols. Everyone is advised to stay in groups." Panic rippled through the crowd. Aisha felt her heartbeat stumble. 3 disappearances now. 3 girls. And the strange figure she had seen yesterday. Was it connected? Trying to steady her thoughts, she whispered to Hania, "We need to check the staircase again." Hania's eyes widened with fear. "Aisha, are you crazy? After everything, we have to," Aisha insisted. "Something is happening there." Reluctantly, Hania agreed, and together they made their way to the back of the science block when classes ended. The staircase looked even darker today, shadows pooling like ink, the air colder than the rest of the campus. Aisha hesitated at the top, the memory of the carved symbol burning in her mind. As they descended, the silence grew heavier, as if the air itself were holding its breath. At the bottom, the symbol was still there, deep, jagged, sinister. But something else caught Aisha's eye, a small piece of cloth caught between 2 cracks in the wall. She reached for it and recognized the fabric instantly. It belonged to the scarf lying beside the guard yesterday, the missing girl's scarf. Hania clapped a hand over her mouth, her voice trembling. "Aisha, this place isn't safe. We need to leave." But before they could turn away, a faint whisper drifted through the air. Soft, fragile, and unmistakably a girl's voice. "Help me." Aisha froze. The notebook in her bag seemed to thrum with energy. She and Hania stared at each other, terror widening their eyes. The voice came again, faint but desperate. "Help me." A cold shiver raced down Aisha's spine. The fog thickened around the mystery, and this time, it had spoken. Chapter 5. Secrets in Silk. The whisper clung to Aisha's ears long after it faded, a fragile plea that reverberated through her bones as she and Hania stumbled back from the staircase. The campus around them felt unchanged, students chatting in distant corridors, the hum of afternoon life continuing as though nothing unusual had happened. But for the 2 girls, every sound seemed muted, every shadow stretched darker than before. Aisha's hands trembled as she clutched the edge of her bag, feeling the faint throb of the notebook within, a steady pulse that seemed to sync with her own racing heartbeat. She tried to breathe normally, but the memory of the voice, soft, broken, undeniably real, wouldn't let her calm down. Hania grabbed her arm, urging her forward, and together they hurried away from the staircase, determined not to look back. They found refuge near the old library, where the tall trees cast wavering patterns of shade over the worn benches. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of everything, 3 disappearances, the eerie figure, the haunting voice, pressed down on them like a suffocating blanket. Hania finally exhaled shakily and whispered, "Aisha, this is getting out of hand. We can't keep pretending this is something we can handle." Aisha's gaze remained fixed on the ground. "But what choice do we have? That girl, whoever she is, she was asking for help. We can't ignore that." Hania ran a hand through her hair, frustration and fear tangled together in her expression. "We're students, Aisha, not detectives, not heroes." Aisha looked up, her voice steadier than she felt. "Maybe not. but we're the only ones who've seen what others haven't. Their conversation halted abruptly when the librarian, an elderly woman with spectacles perched low on her nose, approached them with slow steps. "You girls look troubled," she remarked gently. "Is everything all right?" Aisha hesitated, then nodded weakly. "Just exams," she lied. The librarian offered a kind smile. "This place has seen many stressed students, but remember, books often hold solutions where we least expect them." She walked away, humming softly, but her words lingered in Aisha's mind like a subtle nudge. Books, solutions, unexpected places. Her gaze drifted to the notebook in her bag again. Was it holding solutions or simply dragging her deeper into danger? When Hania left for her class, Aisha decided to visit the library alone. The quiet interior offered a brief sense of peace, with rows of dusty shelves basking in the golden afternoon light. She wandered toward a secluded section near the back, where old campus records and newspapers were kept. Something inside her insisted she start there. Instinct, or perhaps something more. As she scanned the shelves, she found a stack of student newsletters from previous years. She sifted through them absent-mindedly until a particular headline caught her eye. "Local teen mysteriously disappears. Case remains unsolved." The paper was dated 5 years ago. A familiar chill snaked down her spine as she read the name of the missing girl, Sana Malik. Her breath hitched. The symbol carved near the staircase had appeared in the background of an old photograph attached to the article. She leaned closer, heart pounding. It was smaller, less defined, but unmistakably the same shape. Why would a symbol tied to an old disappearance suddenly reappear now? And why was it connected to her notebook, to the whispers, to the figure lurking in shadows? Before she could dig further, a sudden cold swept over the library's back section. Aisha froze, her grip tightening around the newsletter. The quiet hum of the fans seemed to vanish. Slowly, she turned her head. A shadow flickered near the end of the aisle, thin, wavering like a silhouette caught between worlds. Aisha stepped back instinctively, her body trembling. The air grew, heavier, thicker, pressing against her chest. For a brief moment, the shadow seemed to take shape. Long hair, a slender outline, the faintest hint of a face. But as soon as Aisha blinked, it dissolved into nothing. Shaken, she stumbled out of the aisle and leaned against the nearest table, struggling to steady her breathing. She needed answers before she lost her sanity. With trembling fingers, she pulled out the notebook and placed it on the table. "Who are you?" she whispered, feeling foolish and desperate. "What do you want from me?" The notebook remained still, its cover cold beneath her touch. But then, her heart nearly stopped as faint letters began to form on a blank page. Slowly, painfully, as though scratched by an invisible hand. "Find the truth before it finds you," Aisha gasped, slamming the notebook shut as fear surged through her. The words burned in her mind, a warning layered beneath a plea. She grabbed the notebook and ran out of the library, unable to endure the suffocating silence any longer. Outside, sunlight washed over her, but it did little to warm her trembling body. She searched for Hania, spotting her near the cafeteria steps. Rushing forward, she pulled her friend aside and thrust the notebook at her. "It wrote something," she whispered urgently. "Hania, it wrote a message." Hania stared at her in disbelief. "What do you mean it wrote?" "Aisha, notebooks don't write on their own." But when Aisha opened it to the page, the writing remained, faint, eerie, undeniable. Hania's expression shifted from skepticism to fear. This is not normal. Aisha, we have to tell someone. A teacher, the police, anyone." Aisha shook her head firmly. "And say what? That a notebook is talking to us? They'll think we've lost our minds." Hania pressed her lips together, torn between reason and fear. Before they could decide, the campus speakers crackled again, announcing that all students were to return home early due to security concerns. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Students murmured anxiously. Teachers hurried between buildings. Phones buzzed with messages from worried families. Aisha and Hania exchanged a heavy look. Things were escalating faster than either of them had expected. On their way out, they passed the staircase once more. Aisha couldn't resist glancing toward it. For a second, just a heartbeat, she saw the silhouette again, standing at the bottom, still, waiting. Her breath caught. The figure tilted its head ever so slightly as though acknowledging her presence, then faded into the darkness. Aisha clutched the notebook to her chest as she hurried away with Hania. The mystery wasn't just deepening, it was following her. Chapter 6. The Vanishing Needleworker. Aisha hardly slept that night, lying awake in her darkened room as the shadows seemed to breathe and stretch across the walls. Every creak of the house made her flinch. Every whisper of wind outside sent chills crawling across her skin. The notebook lay closed on her bedside table, but even with the lamp switched off, she felt its presence like a faint glow in the darkness, an unseen weight, pulsing, waiting. She replayed the words written on its page. Find the truth before it finds you, until they looped endlessly in her mind. The warning was too deliberate, too pointed to ignore. But the truth of what? And what did it mean that something was going to find her? As dawn approached and the sky began to pale, she still hadn't drifted into sleep. The only certainty she carried into the morning was that whatever was happening was not finished with her yet. By the time she reached campus, her nerves were strung as tight as violin strings. The air felt heavy, charged, as though the atmosphere itself sensed the fear rippling through the students who arrived in uneasy clusters. Conversations murmured through the courtyard, tense whispers about the missing girls, rumors of strange sightings, frantic messages from families demanding their children return home before sunset. Aisha scanned the crowd for Hania, spotting her near the main entrance. Hania rushed over immediately, her face drawn with worry. I called you last night, she said, gripping Aisha's arm. You didn't pick up. Aisha exhaled shakily. I couldn't talk. I barely slept. Hania's expression softened. We need a plan. We can't keep reacting. We have to take control of this somehow. But taking control felt impossible. Even as they walked toward their class, Aisha sensed something watching her. Not someone. Something. The presence she had felt the night before seemed to trail behind her like a shadow that refused to detach. She found herself glancing over her shoulder constantly. The corridors seemed narrower than usual, the fluorescent lights flickering slightly as though disturbed by an unseen force. When they entered the classroom, Aisha's eyes were drawn immediately to the back corner where one of the girls who had gone missing had been sitting only last week. The empty seat seemed to hollow out the room, leaving behind a vacuum of dread. The teacher began class, but Aisha couldn't focus. Her eyes drifted to her bag where the notebook lay hidden. She swore she felt it vibrate, just a faint tremor, but enough to make her fingers twitch. She resisted the urge to take it out, afraid of what she might find if she did. Instead, she stared blankly at the board, her thoughts spiraling. The symbol on the staircase, the whisper, the shadow in the library, the warning, everything pointed to a pattern, a connection threading silently beneath the surface. But she still couldn't see the full picture, like trying to assemble a puzzle when half the pieces were missing. At lunch break, she and Hania retreated to the far side of the sports ground, hoping for a moment of clarity. Instead, they found themselves circling the same questions over and over. What if the notebook was owned by Sana Malik? Hania suggested hesitantly. The girl who disappeared 5 years ago? Aisha nodded slowly. Then maybe she's the one trying to communicate with me. But why now? Hania frowned. Maybe because whatever caused her disappearance is happening again. The possibility made Aisha's stomach twist. And the symbol, it was present back then too. Hania shivered. Meaning whoever, or whatever, is behind this, never stopped. Before they could continue, a strong gust of icy wind whipped across the ground, sending goosebumps across their arms despite the warm afternoon. The leaves rustled violently above them, almost as if warning them away. Aisha hugged herself, her breath puffing faintly in the sudden chill. "Did you feel that?" she whispered. Hania nodded, eyes wide. That wasn't normal. The ground beneath them seemed to hum, barely perceptible, but enough that the hairs on Aisha's arms stood on end. Then from somewhere behind them, a faint sound drifted through the air. A slow, dragging footstep. They turned sharply, but no one was there. The sports field was nearly empty. Only a few students lingered near the benches on the far side, too distant to have made the sound. Aisha's pulse spiked. The footstep came again, closer this time, yet still no one was visible. Hania grabbed her hand, whispering, "Aisha, we need to leave." They backed away quickly, hearts pounding until the cold sensation faded and the air stilled once more. Shaken, they returned indoors, where the hallways now seemed safer despite the suffocating atmosphere. As they walked, they unexpectedly encountered the librarian again. She stopped in front of them, her kind eyes shadowed with concern. "You girls were in the stacks yesterday," she said softly. "The older records section." Aisha swallowed hard. "Yes, I was reading about Sana Malik." The librarian nodded slowly. "I remember her. A bright girl, very quiet, very curious." She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "She used to sit alone in the back of the library, often scribbling in a small notebook." Aisha felt her breath stop. "A notebook?" The librarian nodded again. "Yes, dark green cover, always with her." Aisha's bag felt suddenly heavier. "Do you know what happened to her?" she asked. The librarian's eyes softened with sadness. "Only rumors, but she came to me once, a few days before she vanished. She seemed frightened. She asked if I believed that things could attach themselves to objects, memories, feelings, sometimes even spirits." Hania stiffened. Aisha felt her legs turn to water. "And what did you tell her?" Aisha whispered. The librarian sighed. "I told her that troubled minds often find troubled symbols, but now..." She looked at Aisha with unsettling clarity. Now I wonder if she was trying to warn someone. Before Aisha could respond, her phone buzzed, violently in her pocket. She pulled it out and cold dread washed over her as she read the message. No name, no number. Only a single line. "Stop looking." Her hands shook as she showed it to Hania. "Someone's watching us," Hania whispered, her voice barely audible. "Someone who doesn't want us to know the truth." Aisha felt her chest tighten. The message wasn't just a threat. It was a promise. That afternoon, the tension on campus reached a breaking point. Teachers dismissed classes early again. Security guards patrolled in pairs. Students hurried home in frightened groups. Aisha and Hania stayed close together as they made their way out. But just before exiting through the main gate, Aisha felt a pull, an invisible tug toward the old staircase. She turned slightly, unable to stop herself, and her blood ran cold. There at the bottom of the staircase, barely visible in the dim light, stood the same shadowy figure. This time, it didn't disappear. It raised an arm, slow, deliberate, and pointed straight at her. Aisha's breath caught in her throat. The truth wasn't waiting for her to find it anymore. It was coming for her. Chapter 7. The last stitch unravels. Aisha stumbled back from the gate, her pulse thundering in her ears as the shadowy figure held its arm raised, pointing at her with a slow, chilling certainty. The world around her seemed to narrow until only that gesture existed, silent, deliberate, and terrifying. Hania followed her gaze and froze, her breath sharp and uneven. "Aisha, it's really there," she whispered, as though saying it aloud made it more real, more dangerous. But in the seconds it took for Aisha to blink, the figure dissolved into the dimness beneath the staircase, melting into the shadows like smoke. The sudden emptiness left behind was just as unnerving. It felt like the figure had retreated, not vanished, watching from just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to reappear. Aisha couldn't stop shaking as she tore her gaze away and allowed Hania to pull her toward the street, where people bustled and cars passed, grounding her in a reality that now felt thin and fragile. They walked in silence for several minutes, each step echoing with questions neither dared to voice. It wasn't until they reached a quieter stretch of road that Hania finally spoke. "Aisha, we can't ignore this anymore. This isn't just about a notebook or disappearances or old symbols. Something is following you." Aisha swallowed hard, her throat dry. "I know. And I think it wants something from me." Hania shook her head firmly. "Or it wants to warn you, you don't know which one." But Aisha wasn't convinced. The pointing gesture had felt like a command, not a warning, a summons. She gripped her bag tightly, feeling the outline of the notebook pressing through the fabric like a heartbeat against her palm. At home, she barely spoke during dinner, her mind drifting back repeatedly to the library, the staircase, the cold gust on the sports ground. Her parents exchanged worried glances but didn't press her, assuming school stress was the culprit. When she retreated to her room afterward, she locked the door and pulled the notebook out, placing it on her desk with trembling fingers. For several minutes, she just stared at it, fear and curiosity warring inside her. The warning text from the afternoon still echoed in her mind. "Stop looking." Whoever had sent it knew exactly what she was doing. They were tracking her, watching her. But the shadowy figure wasn't a person. It wasn't something that could send messages or type on a phone. There were two forces at play, one visible, one unseen, and both seemed dangerously intertwined. Gathering her courage, she opened the notebook to the page with the warning. The letters remained etched faintly into the paper. She flipped through the earlier entries, the scribbles, the symbols, the fragmented sentences that made no sense. But something felt different now. The edges of the pages seemed to darken as she touched them, reacting to her presence. She took a deep breath and whispered, "What do you want me to find?" For a long moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, as though compelled by an invisible hand, a new line emerged on a blank page. "Look where it began." Aisha felt chills crawl up her arms. "Where it began," she repeated softly, trying to make sense of it. Sana Malik's disappearance? The old symbol? The staircase? She grabbed her laptop and searched news archives about the 5-year-old case, scanning through vague reports and rumors. But the one consistent detail that stood out was that Sana had last been seen near, the words jumped out at her, the abandoned hostel building at the far edge of campus. Aisha sat back, heart pounding. The old hostel shut down years ago due to structural damage and frequent trespassers. Students whispered about it, some claiming it was haunted, others saying the administration kept it closed because of unpleasant history. And now the notebook was telling her to go there. Just as she closed her laptop, her phone buzzed again. Aisha hesitated before picking it up. A new message. Same unknown number. "Don't go there." Her breath hitched. Before she could process it, another message followed. "You don't understand what's waiting." Aisha's hands trembled as she showed the texts to Hania through a video call. Hania's face paled instantly. "Aisha, this is a trap." Whoever is sending these messages knows you've been looking into Sana, and the notebook is telling you something else entirely. Two different sources, two different motives. Aisha nodded, fear clenching tightly in her chest. But which one is telling the truth? Hania hesitated. We won't know until... Her voice trailed off. She knew what Aisha was thinking even before she said it. We have to go to the hostel, Aisha whispered. Hania's eyes widened. Aisha, no. That building is dangerous, and if the messages are warnings, they could also be threats. Aisha interrupted. Someone doesn't want me to go there, and that means there's something there worth finding. Hania bit her lip, torn between fear and loyalty. Finally, she sighed. If you go, I'm not letting you go alone. Relief washed through Aisha. Together felt safer, even if the safety was only an illusion. They agreed to meet early the next morning before classes when the campus would be quiet. Aisha barely slept that night, drifting in and out of nightmare-laced dreams where shadows stretched toward her, hands reaching, voices whispering her name. Each time she woke, she felt the notebook watching from the desk, still impatient. By dawn, she gave up on sleep entirely and prepared for the day with numb, mechanical movements. The campus was unnervingly silent when she arrived. A thin fog hugged the ground, swirling around the trees like spectral breath. She spotted Hania waiting near the side path that led toward the forbidden edge of the grounds. Are you sure about this? Hania asked quietly. Aisha nodded, though her legs felt like they might give out at any moment. The path grew narrower as they approached the old hostel. Overgrown bushes clawed at the edges and the building stood in eerie stillness, its walls cracked, windows shattered, and paint peeling like dead skin. The air around it felt colder, heavier, as if soaked with years of forgotten memories. Aisha stepped forward cautiously, feeling an almost magnetic pull drawing her closer. Hania clutched her sleeve tightly, whispering, I don't like this, something feels wrong. Just then a shadow flickered across the broken doorway, fast, silent, unmistakably human-shaped. Aisha froze, the shadow paused, then slowly turned. Even from the distance, Aisha saw the hollow outline of a face, blurred, pale, empty. The same figure from the staircase. It stood motionless for a heartbeat, then lifted its arm again, pointing at the entrance of the hostel. Aisha felt the world tilt. The truth wasn't just inside. It was calling her in. Chapter 8. A Stitch Out of Time. Miss Marple awoke the next morning with the distinct feeling that the final threads of the puzzle were beginning to tug in her direction, though they were not yet ready to lie neatly in her palm. The village was unusually quiet for a Thursday, subdued in a way that often occurred when gossip had reached its peak and now retreated into a waiting silence. She dressed in a soft gray cardigan pinned with a small blue brooch shaped like a thimble, a gift from her late cousin, and made her way downstairs with purposeful steps. The house felt unusually brisk, as though it too sensed a shift in the air. After a modest breakfast she did not linger over, she stepped out into the crisp daylight and turned toward the green, where several villagers stood murmuring in small clusters, their glances shifting toward the lane leading to the manor. Something new had happened. Miss Marple could tell by the uneasy flutter at the edges of conversation, like birds unsure whether to settle or scatter. It did not take long for Mrs. Carter, who could never resist the opportunity to be first with news, to hurry toward her with cheeks flushed pink from excitement. Oh, Miss Marple, you won't believe it. Inspector Graves is back at the manor already. There's been another discovery. She lowered her voice dramatically, though the entire green could hear her. In Mrs. Fortescue's sewing room. Miss Marple inclined her head gently, thanked her, and walked on with calm steps, though her pulse picked up. The sewing room mattered, It mattered because Aunt Louisa had kept her most personal work there. The fine samplers, delicate lace trims, and the particularly intricate embroidered panel she had been secretly preparing for the Harvest Festival competition. It mattered because the sewing room was not a place anyone wandered into accidentally. At the manor, she was greeted by the familiar sight of Inspector Graves's tall, slightly impatient frame. He tipped his hat courteously but looked as though he had spent the morning chewing on his own frustration. "Miss Marple," he began, "I suppose it was inevitable you'd come?" She smiled serenely. "It does seem that mysteries have an unfortunate habit of occurring in places where I am already visiting. Quite inefficient, really." He huffed, half amused. "Well, if you must know, the housekeeper found something rather odd this morning. Come along." He led her up the staircase toward the sewing room, the scent of lavender polish lingering faintly in the cool air. When they arrived, Miss Marple paused in the doorway, taking in the room as though it were a tableau meant to be read as carefully as handwriting. Everything was meticulously in place, as Louisa always kept it. The neat rows of colored cotton reels, the half-finished embroidery frame near the window, the small needle case shaped like a strawberry. But there, placed with almost exaggerated carelessness on the work table, lay a single, partially unspooled thread, deep burgundy, the exact shade Louisa had used for the borders of her competition piece. Miss Marple stepped closer. "Was this here before?" she asked softly. The inspector shook his head. "The housekeeper swears she tidied last night. Says all the threads were organized by color as usual." Miss Marple nodded faintly. "Yes, Louisa always wound her threads very tightly. This one has been unwound by someone unfamiliar with her habits. Odd thing is," Graves continued, "there were footprints by the window, small ones. Not a man's. Damp, too, must have come from the garden, but the ground outside doesn't show anything obvious." Miss Marple touched the burgundy thread lightly. "I wonder, Inspector, if someone wanted us to find this." He frowned. "You mean it's staged?" "Possibly, or perhaps someone panicked and left in a hurry." She did not say the rest aloud. Someone who needed to retrieve or replace something connected to the embroidery itself. As they examined the room further, Miss Marple's attention snagged on the embroidery frame near the window. She leaned in. "This is not quite right," she murmured. A tiny, almost imperceptible shift in stitch direction. Louisa's work was always flawless. She had won prizes for her needlework even in her youth. But this square of cross-stitch had a single motif where the tension looked different, too tight, done by someone either inexperienced or hurried. Graves folded his arms. "You think someone altered the embroidery?" "Not altered," Miss Marple whispered. "Added. Last night, after Louisa's passing." She traced the pattern with her eyes, a series of tiny flowers, and there, between two petals, a barely visible initial stitched in with the wrong shade of gold. Not Louisa's gold, a newer one, slightly glossier. "Someone sent a message," she said softly. "A message sewn into the work itself." Inspector Graves stared. "Well, But why hide a message in needlework?" Miss Marple was quiet for a long moment. "Because needlework is often overlooked by those who do not understand it. It is seen as ornamental rather than communicative. But Aunt Louisa knew better. She kept records of her designs, her stitch choices, even her color selections. Anyone trying to change something would have to know she documented everything." The inspector considered this. So someone looked for something in the sewing room, documents perhaps, and then left this message instead. "Or," Miss Marple replied, "they found something they wished they hadn't." She stepped back, letting her eyes wander over the room once more. Her gaze drifted toward the small wooden box near the bookcase. Louisa's pattern archive. She opened it gently, expecting to find the usual methodical notes. But today something else waited inside, a folded scrap of linen no bigger than a handkerchief embroidered with an unfamiliar motif, a small key intertwined with a vine. Miss Marple's breath caught, not because she recognized the symbol, but because Louisa had once mentioned in passing during a rambling afternoon tea conversation that she sometimes designed secret samplers inspired by the old village folklore. And one of those stories involved a hidden key belonging to a forgotten storeroom beneath the manor, sealed decades ago during the war. Miss Marple closed the box carefully. "Inspector," she said gently, "I believe this clue was not meant for the police. It was meant for someone who understood the old stories of the manor, someone who knew how Louisa thought." Graves raised a brow. "Meaning you?" She lowered her gaze modestly. "Meaning anyone who paid attention." As they left the sewing room, Miss Marple found herself replaying conversations from the past few days. Eleanor's peculiar anxiety, Mr. Tilbury's evasiveness about the old storeroom when she asked him about the history of the manor, Mrs. Penworthy's odd slip about having seen a light from the sewing room late at night, when she had earlier claimed to be at her sister's cottage, and Nora's insistence that Louisa had been working on a special commission she wasn't allowed to discuss. Outside the manor, Miss Marple paused, breathing in the cool afternoon air. The sun was already lowering, casting long shadows across the gravel path. She walked slowly toward the garden, following a thought rather than a direction. The footprints Graves mentioned, small, damp, might have come from this very patch of earth near the herb beds. She knelt gracefully, brushing aside a cluster of mint leaves, and found what she hoped to find, a faint thread caught on a thorn. Burgundy, the same shade as the one in the sewing room. But what struck her most was not the thread. It was the partial imprint of a heel, delicate and narrow, a woman's shoe, and not Eleanor's sensible type, nor Mrs. Penworthy's orthopedic ones. Someone lighter, younger, someone who moved quickly and with more stealth than confidence. Miss Marple stood slowly, smoothing her skirt. She looked toward the narrow path leading to the village, where the shadows stretched like long, dark ribbons. She felt the threads of the mystery tightening, pulling her toward a conclusion she was not yet ready to name. But she knew one thing with certainty. Someone had tried to hide something within Louisa's precious needlework, and someone else had tried to retrieve it. The puzzle was no longer about a misplaced embroidery pattern. It had become a battle of messages whispered through stitches, secrets tucked into fabric, footsteps caught in the earth, and the silent dialogue between maker and intruder. Miss Marple clasped her hands lightly. "Well," she murmured to herself, "I shall simply have to follow where the thread leads." And with quiet determination she set off down the path toward St. Mary Mead, ready to unravel the next knot in the growing tapestry of intrigue. Chapter 9. The Pattern Revealed. By the time Miss Marple returned to the manor that evening, the dusk had deepened into a lavender-gray veil over St. Mary Mead, softening the edges of every hedge and cottage as though the village itself were holding its breath. A faint breeze stirred the branches of the elms along the drive, whispering like someone trying not to be overheard. Miss Marple walked with steady purpose, her mind knitting together each clue with the quiet certainty of a seamstress bringing order to tangled floss. The burgundy thread in the garden, the altered stitch in the embroidery frame, the secret sampler of the key motif. All of it had formed a pattern at last, one that pointed toward a revelation she could no longer put aside. Inside the manor, Inspector Graves stood in the drawing room with the air of a man thoroughly done with puzzling subtleties. 3 of the suspects were present as well: Eleanor, pale and rigid as a pressed leaf, Mr. Tilbury, shifting nervously from foot to foot, and Nora, arms folded tight across her chest as though bracing against an unseen wind. Mrs. Penworthy sat primly on the sofa, her knitting needles idle for the first time in days. Miss Marple didn't bother with pleasantries. "I believe," she began, her voice soft but firm, "that we now understand why poor Louisa's needlework became the center of this unfortunate business." Graves looked at her with a mixture of hope and weariness. "You mean you've solved it, Miss Marple?" "It is not so much solved as illuminated," she replied gently. "If you will indulge me a few minutes." She stepped closer to the fire, clasping her hands before her. Louisa discovered something in the old storeroom beneath the manor. The storeroom sealed during the war. Something she wished to share discreetly, and so she used the medium she trusted most. Her embroidery. She began stitching a motif that referenced the key to that storeroom. But someone saw her working on it. Someone understood or feared what she had found. Mr. Tilbury exhaled sharply. "All this over a storeroom?" Miss Marple gave him a mild, sympathetic glance. "A storeroom that, as it happens, contains ration records, financial ledgers, and receipts from the wartime years. Most people would find them dull as dishwater, but not someone who had reason to fear old records being brought to light." She turned her gaze to Mrs. Penworthy. The housekeeper stiffened. "I don't know what you're implying, Miss Marple," she said, her voice trembling on the edges. "But I've served this family faithfully for more than 38 years, Miss Marple gently finished for her. "Yes, indeed. You came in 1915, I believe, the very year the manor changed ownership after the previous land taxes became overdue." A murmur ran through the room. Miss Marple continued, "You see, my dear, loyalty can be commendable. But fear is quite another matter." She walked slowly toward the center of the room, her steps soft on the carpet. During the war, the manor received additional government stipends for housing evacuee supplies. Most of the village remembers this. But what fewer people know, except those who handled the storeroom, is that some of those funds were quietly diverted. Small sums at first, later larger. Someone had been altering the ration records, shifting numbers just enough to slip unnoticed. Graves straightened. "You're saying someone was stealing government funds during wartime?" "Yes," Miss Marple said mildly. "And doing so required access which only two people had. Louisa, who oversaw the inventory, and Mrs. Penworthy, who managed household accounts." Mrs. Penworthy's face drained of color, yet she raised her chin stubbornly. "Louisa would never have accused me," she muttered. "No," Miss Marple agreed. "She would not. But she would have quietly corrected the record, and in doing so, revealed the alterations. You feared she would expose what had been happening more than a decade earlier?" Nora gasped softly, pressing a hand to her mouth. But Mrs. Penworthy is the most respectable woman in the village." Miss Marple nodded sadly. "Respectable people, my dear, are capable of foolish decisions when desperation presses hard enough. And Mrs. Penworthy had debts in those years, debts she has worked tirelessly to repay." The housekeeper's eyes flashed with grief and fury. "I didn't harm Louisa," she whispered. "I didn't. But I did go into the sewing room the night before she died. I saw that blasted embroidery, saw the little key she was stitching. I knew she'd found the storeroom ledger. I panicked." Miss Marple's expression remained soft, almost maternal. "You tried to remove the evidence, but you could not take the embroidery frame, it would be too noticeable. So you tried to unpick the motif. But Louisa used tight, careful stitches, and you, unused to needlework, made a small mistake. The stitch tightened the wrong way, leaving a mark." Mr. Tilbury rubbed his forehead. "But why leave a thread in the garden? Why track mud into the sewing room?" Mrs. Penworthy swallowed hard. "It was dark. I dropped the thread outside when sneaking in through the garden door. And when I heard footsteps in the corridor, I panicked and slipped out again. I didn't mean—" Miss Marple raised a gentle hand, stopping her. "Yes, my dear, you meant no harm. And in truth, your actions, while foolish and certainly unlawful, did not cause Louisa's death. She died of natural causes. But your attempts to cover your old misdeeds made the mystery of her final embroidery seem far more sinister." Graves sighed, rubbing his temples. "So this entire business was about covering up wartime theft?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "A very human motive, Inspector. Shame can be a powerful force." But Miss Marple was not finished. She turned toward Eleanor, whose trembling hands had not gone unnoticed. "However," she said softly, "there is still the matter of the missing document Louisa discovered in the storeroom." Eleanor flinched. I returned it," she cried suddenly, her voice breaking. "I found it on Mother's sewing table the morning she passed. I recognized my father's signature. He'd been the one overseeing the supplies during the war. I thought it might look like he'd done something improper, and I couldn't bear the thought of scandal." Miss Marple nodded gently. "You were trying to protect your father's memory, and so you hid the document in your own bureau drawer. But, dear Eleanor, your father was innocent." Eleanor blinked in confusion. "But his name was forged," Miss Marple said kindly, "by Mrs. Penworthy. Your father never signed those altered ledgers." The room fell silent. Mrs. Penworthy buried her face in her hands. Whether in shame, exhaustion, or some relief at the truth finally spoken, it was impossible to say. Miss Marple exhaled softly and looked around the drawing room, her gaze tender. "You see," she said, "the past leaves its marks, just as needlework does. Tiny stitches, each insignificant alone, but together forming patterns we cannot ignore." Graves nodded slowly, his expression heavy but grateful. "I suppose that's it, then." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Not quite. There is still one final matter to discuss, but that may be best addressed in the morning, over tea." And as the room slowly settled into weary acceptance, Miss Marple felt the last threads of the puzzle fall neatly into place, ready at last to be tied off in the final chapter. Chapter 10. Morning tea and the final stitch. The morning sun spilled gently over St. Mary Mead, bathing the village in a soft golden light that seemed to wash away the shadows of the past week. Miss Marple sat in her cozy sitting room, the teapot steaming beside her, and poured herself a cup of Earl Grey, the comforting aroma mingling with the faint scent of freshly baked scones. Hania sat opposite her, hands clasped tightly around her own cup, eyes still wide from the revelations of the previous evening. Mrs. Penworthy had arrived shortly after dawn, bringing a tray of biscuits with her usual quiet dignity, and Eleanor lingered near the window, her expression a mixture of relief and lingering anxiety. The manor and its secrets now felt almost distant, softened by the steady rhythm of village life. Yet Miss Marple knew that the lessons of the mystery would linger far longer than the morning light. She sipped her tea thoughtfully, letting the warmth settle through her hands, and glanced around at those present. "You see," she began gently, "this entire matter, this tangled web of shadows, whispers, and mislaid stitches, has taught us something rather important about human nature. We are all capable of error, of fear, of concealment, and yet all capable also of redemption and courage." Hania listened intently, leaning forward as though every word might hold the key to understanding the weeks of tension she had endured. Miss Marple set down her cup and reached across the table to pick up the now famous notebook, the center of so much unease, yet strangely benign in the soft morning light. She opened it carefully, running a fingertip across the faint, elegant handwriting Louisa had left behind, and pointed to the final stitched page. Louisa's last message was never meant to frighten anyone. It was intended as guidance, a gentle nudge toward the truth that had long been buried beneath small fears and older lies. The key in her embroidery, the altered stitches, the seemingly cryptic thread, they were all meant to direct a careful observer toward what had truly occurred in the storeroom all those years ago. Courage, vigilance, and a patient eye were required to discern it. Eleanor drew a shaky breath, sitting down with her hands folded neatly in her lap. "I thought we were all doomed to misunderstand her," she murmured. "And yet, it was all right there if we had only looked carefully." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Indeed, my dear. Sometimes the most profound truths are hidden in plain sight, and the smallest details, the gentle tug of a thread, the alignment of a stitch, reveal what even loud words cannot." The room settled into a comfortable silence, filled only with the clink of china and the soft ticking of the clock as Miss Marple continued her gentle debrief. "Mrs. Penworthy," she said kindly, "your actions, though misguided, were born of fear. And fear is a very human response. It is to your credit that you confessed willingly, allowing the truth to emerge without further harm. As for Eleanor, your desire to protect your father, though it caused additional confusion, demonstrates loyalty and courage in equal measure. And finally, to all of you, the lesson remains. Even the smallest observation, the tiniest discrepancy, can illuminate truths far larger than they appear." Hania exhaled a long breath, leaning back in her chair, a sense of relief washing over her like warm sunlight. "So, everything is settled?" she asked, a faint smile breaking through her tense expression. Miss Marple nodded, lifting her teacup in a small, dignified gesture. "Yes, everything has been settled. The ledger has been returned to its proper place, the mystery of the storeroom clarified, and the puzzle of the embroidery resolved. And more importantly, the village can now breathe once more, secure in the knowledge that the past, however tangled, has been laid to rest with honesty and care." As the conversation drifted to lighter topics, the upcoming harvest festival, village gossip, and the state of the rose gardens, Miss Marple's mind wandered for a moment to the staircase near the science block, the whispers of the notebook and the shadowy figure that had so persistently followed Aisha's path. She had already pieced together that those events were less sinister than they seemed, the echoes of old fears manifesting in young imaginations, yet they had served an important purpose, reminding her of the value of careful attention, patience, and quiet deduction. Hania, sensing her thoughtful silence, reached over and squeezed her hand. "Thank you, Miss Marple," she said softly, "for guiding us, for explaining everything, for making it all make sense." Miss Marple smiled gently, the lines of age around her eyes softening with warmth. "It is not I who should be thanked, my dear," she replied, "but observation, patience, and the small courage to look closely where others might not. And of course, Louisa herself, whose careful stitching led us step by step to understanding. She deserves our gratitude most of all." The morning passed in this gentle rhythm, the village outside beginning to hum with ordinary life once more. Children laughing as they walked to school, the blacksmith hammering in the distance, neighbors greeting one another warmly on their morning errands. In the midst of it, Miss Marple rose quietly, moving to the window to watch the sunlight play over the hedgerows, her mind settling into the satisfying pattern of resolved events. She reflected on the threads of the mystery, some frayed, some taut, some intertwined in unexpected ways, and felt the quiet satisfaction of a puzzle brought to completion. The hum of life beyond the window reminded her that while mysteries would always exist, so too would understanding, kindness, and the steady rhythm of human nature, ever weaving its own intricate patterns. Finally, she returned to the table, sat down, and lifted her cup once more. "We must remember," she said, her voice carrying the gentle authority of experience, that mysteries, like life, are composed of many small pieces. A stitch here, a thread there, a fleeting observation. These are what ultimately reveal the whole. And in the end, it is patience, care, and a willingness to see the truth without fear that allow us to restore balance and peace. The others nodded solemnly, their faces brightened by understanding and relief. The teapot whistled gently, and Miss Marple poured a final cup for herself, savoring the warm steam. The day was calm, the past reconciled, the threads of mystery finally stitched together into a complete, satisfying pattern. And as the village of St. Mary Mead basked in the morning sun, Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet smile of contentment, the kind that comes only from seeing justice, truth, and humanity interwoven so seamlessly, like the finest embroidery. The gentle clatter of cups and the soft murmur of conversation continued as the last page of the notebook rested unopened on the table, a silent testament to secrets kept, discoveries made, and the enduring power of observation, patience, and care. And with that, the story of the needlework puzzle drew to a comforting close, leaving only warmth, understanding, and the quiet promise that every mystery, even the most delicate and intricately stitched, can be unraveled with a steady hand and a keen eye.